Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast for the Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. As you can tell, my voice is a little raspy. Got a little sick while I was away on a little trip, but nevertheless, I am still hanging in there. I think I'm pretty much recovered, although the voice certainly doesn't say so. The cough just sort of lingers, which is sort of a pain, right? So anyways, if you're wondering, if you're new to this podcast, the Living the Wildlife podcast is all about dealing with vertebrate pest management and how to do that from a professional and technically accurate point of view, and that's what we're all about. There are plenty of other podcasts out there to talk about how to set this or that trap, and we do that occasionally, but we try to get geeky here as part of the Pest Geek Podcast, so I get into some of the research literature that isn't always going to be dealt with by people within the wildlife control field, because as I always say, if you're doing what everyone else is doing, you don't have a competitive advantage. And so I delve into some of those technical issues that other people are not going to take the time to deal with. But we're glad to have you on board. We do hope you subscribe to the channel. Definitely ring the bell. And if you have comments, thoughts, criticisms, perhaps you'd like to be on the show, perhaps you have something where you have a recommendation for what should be on the show, definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. And we're always looking for people who have ideas and techniques and equipment and supplies that want to market their material to a wider audience. I'd love to have you on the show. No charge. It's sort of strange, in terms of free advertisement. Yeah, there's no tricks here. We're happy to have you on. Happy to have you on the show. Just reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. This week, we're going to be talking a little bit about ticks and how to kill them. As you know, Lyme disease is a significant problem within the United States, and a lot of people get infected by it. Thankfully, in Montana, they have not declared us as a location where Lyme disease can be contracted, although there are certainly people within the state who would dispute that claim. But nevertheless, it's not officially here yet, but ticks are nasty creatures without a doubt, and they have caused deep suffering, severe suffering for hundreds of thousands of people in the United States, and I would assume around the world as well. And so they are a very serious issue. So normally we don't deal with insects in the vertebrate pest coverage, but we do deal with those issues where the vertebrate and insect interface, right? So where those issues interface, and certainly ticks are part of it, partly because when you're out in the field, you have the risk of contracting Lyme disease just as part of your operations, right? You may be working in areas where there are ticks, and you could certainly contract them. Of course, your clients would also be individuals who would contract ticks. So I came across an article published in 2024. So let me kind of pull this up here so that you can see it. And the article is entitled "A Rodent and Tick Bait for Controlling White-Footed Mice," that's Paramyscus leucopus, and black-legged ticks, that's Ixodes scapularis, the respective pathogen host and vector of the Lyme disease spirochetes. Now, there's a mouthful there, to be sure. This has been published in the journal Ticks and Tick-Borne Diseases, and the authors are David Posch and Richard Post. Now, they are, I believe, probably the father and son combination of Kaput, which is a bait manufacturer. So don't quote me on all that, but I'm kind of working some memory here. I believe that they are certainly related, and I think it's a father and son situation. But nevertheless, Kaput Manufacturing out of Colorado produces rodenticides for the control, of course, of rodents. And what they've done here is they have tested a fipronil-based warfarin rodenticide to see if it was effective both on white-footed mice and the ticks that infest those mice. So it's a relationship between these white-footed mice will carry the virus, carry the spirochete that causes Lyme disease, and of course ticks can carry the spirochete that causes Lyme disease. And then they're sort of the ticks are feeding on the white-footed mouse, and so they can contract the disease that way, give the disease that way, and of course then the ticks sometimes come onto us. Yeah, it's complicated to be sure. So what they've looked at is like if we add fipronil to a rodenticide, can we kill the mice and kill the ticks residing on the mice? Sort of a 1-2 punch to manage these two particular pests in a very convenient way. You're already out there doing rodent control for white-footed mice. Why not kill the ticks as well? So that's kind of the summary of the idea. So let me give you that article title again. It's called A Rodent and Tick Bait for Controlling White-Footed Mice, that's Paramyscus leucopus, and black-legged ticks, Ixodes scapularis, the respective pathogen host and vector of the Lyme disease spirochetes. And that was published in Ticks and Tick-Borne Diseases, Volume 15, 2024, that's the year, of course, and then the issue number is 102362. So there you go, and I'm going to be summarizing the findings of this particular publication for you to see if it's something you may want to consider adding to your toolbox for those of you in the Northeast and Midwest who have customers who are dealing with concerns about ticks and, of course, concerns about white-footed mice. Now, white-footed mouse range, they come out as far west as we are here in Montana. I'm in the center of the state of Montana, and deer and white-footed mice about end around my area, so there's a little bit of overlap there with the deer mouse. But white-footed mice certainly come out as far west as Montana, but we haven't had the Lyme disease yet. So the concern here, of course, is controlling those ticks because they are a vector for Lyme disease. All right, well, let me get my PowerPoint up here for you, and let's kind of get that started. So let's get a little bit more background here. So understand that Lyme disease is caused by two key spirochete agents. One of them is the most common one, is Borrelia burgdorferi. Let me pronounce that a little better. Borrelia burgdorferi and Borrelia mayoni. Now, the Borrelia mayoni is not as common of an infection source as the Borrelia burgdorferi. So you can see this gets kind of complicated when we're dealing with Lyme disease. Now, according to the CDC, over 500,000 people in the United States on an annual basis are impacted by Lyme disease. And so you may think, boy, those are big numbers. Yeah, there was about, I think, 10 years ago or so, maybe even earlier, the CDC recalculated the number of people they thought were infected. And so that really was a game changer because it was a multiple expansion of the infection. Before, I think it was something like 20 or 30,000 a year or something, and then a change occurred and it went into the hundreds of thousands. So it was definitely serious, and you kind of wonder at times, people who have sort of chronic medical conditions that just don't feel right, and people haven't, and they've gotten some testing done, and they just don't feel right. You kind of wonder if sometimes those are long-term exposure or of these subliminal infections from Lyme disease. You kind of wonder if that's where some of that came in. I have arthritis, and when I went to my doctor for arthritis, he was actually testing me for Lyme disease because, as you know, I lived in the Northeast, so I came up negative. But you kind of wonder how many other people where they were infected with Lyme disease, and their arthritis is caused by that because it was sort of undiagnosed. So it's a serious problem. And so the Lyme disease is vectored by these two organisms, right? Now remember, a vector, think of it as a school bus, right? How does the disease get from point A to point B, and that's a vector, right? So how does the disease get to us? Well, that's by the white-footed mouse, Paramyscus leucopus, and then the black-legged tick, the Ixodes scapularis. And so that's what this research was basically testing for in this particular set. So the black-legged tick, very common to the Northeast United States and the Midwest of the United States. It has an interesting two-stage life cycle, and 90% of the infections of Lyme disease infections, I need to be specific about that, they believe are caused by the nymphal stages of those bites, because every time the tick moves through its growth process till it gets to become an adult, it needs a blood meal. So when it goes from, lymphal stage 1 to nymphal stage 2, it has to get a blood meal. And then so it's got to feed multiple times. And so one of the sources of blood, of course, is the white-footed mouse. And so, and then, of course, we don't want it to be biting us, where it can also get a blood meal. So the study was testing fipronil. Those of you that are insect people are probably very familiar with fipronil. Kills a lot of different insects. And so they were basically adding fipronil to a warfarin rodenticide bait. Now, warfarin is not very commonly used to control rodents in the United States. People typically are using second-generation baits. So, but in warfarin, of course, is not a second-generation bait. It's a first-generation bait. But nevertheless, that's what they're using here. And I believe, because when I spoke to Mr. Post Sr., it was apparent to me, and again, this is my personal opinion here, is certainly my opinion that he did have concerns about using rodenticide products, and that's, in terms of his business model, working with products that were less toxic to secondary or non-target animals. And of course, warfarin is the least toxic to a variety of species. In fact, it's even used to treat humans, right, for certain illnesses like blood clots. So the question that was ultimately they're asking here is, does this mixture of 0.005% fipronil with a 0.025% warfarin, these are the AIs, right, the active ingredients, is that mixture strong enough to kill ticks, and will it also kill white-footed mice? And that is the research question that they were evaluating. Now, an interesting thing about black-legged tick larvae, right, that are coming along their stages there, is that when they're feeding on a host, it takes about 4 days for them to reach full engorgement. Now, I'm showing you a picture here of an adult, right? I didn't have a picture of a larval stage getting a full engorgement. To get fully engorged with blood, and then they detach. So the tick feeds on the organism, on its host, and then once it gets a full blood meal, it's like, okay, I'm done, and it detaches, and then kind of digests it to go and gets the protein it needs to go to its next phase of life. So So there's a period of time where that tick is being exposed to the mice. So the idea is the mouse is feeding on the warfarin bait. While it's getting warfarin to kill the mouse, it's consuming enough fipronil, which is a systemic. And so then as that's going through the bloodstream, the tick that's attached to the mouse is feeding on the fipronil-tainted blood that hopefully will kill the tick. That's the idea. So that's what they're trying to figure out. Will this actually happen? And that's the goal here. So their research design, they had 20 male white-footed mice, 20 female. They kind of split them off into control groups and treatment groups. They used a 15-day choice test. Now, just so you understand a little bit about lab research, when rodenticides are tested, there's different ways that they can test it in the laboratory conditions. One of the ways is what's called a no-choice test. That is, they put the rodenticide in with the rodent, and if the rodent's going to eat, it can only eat what it's given in a no-choice test. In a choice test, they allow the rodent to choose the poison bait or the non-toxic bait. And so the mouse has to personally select. Part of the reason for that is to see if there's any taste issues involved with the treated bait. So in this particular study design, they used a choice test. So all the rodents that were exposed to warfarin had the ability to choose untreated bait. Okay, so it's important for you to realize. Part of that study, because again, they're doing two studies sort of at the same time, is they did a 4-day simulated field test to test fipronil. And there they attached 40 ticks, these were larvae, onto the mice to see if the mice that were feeding on the fipronil treated bait would kill the ticks. So this is quite an operation, right? I mean, research is expensive, and so you got to commend the company for, doing the work, as they would say, to find out if this actually worked. And it was, I kind of intrigued at how they were attaching these, and of course they had to have ways of getting the ticks back. So it was quite a procedure here. Well, let's get to the results, which is probably what you're primarily going to be interested in, right? Now remember, these are averages, right? So they basically summarize the data. And so what they found is that the mice in the treatment group died on average within 7 days. Okay? The ticks died on average within 4 days. Pretty impressive. So this is, and of course the ticks were being killed before the mouse was. Now that's kind of impressive. So some of you may be, those of you familiar with rodenticide active ingredients may have the attitude, oh, well, warfarin, it's such a weak rodenticide, I don't think I'm going to control mice. Well, you need to have a poison that's not going to kill the mice too quickly. But here's the other little secret you may not understand, is that warfarin can kill rodents about as fast as your second gens. So second gens are typically only a day or two faster than the first generation anticoagulants. So sometimes we have some negative attitudes toward first generation anticoagulants that are probably not really grounded in some science. Now, those are all lab studies. Now, whether that changes under actual field conditions, that's a different question. But under laboratory conditions, they're dying about the same time, give or take, and chances are your customers aren't going to be able to tell the difference within 1 or 2 days, to be sure. Now, in terms of the actual details of time to death, here we have the actual data. So again, they had 20 mice in the treatment portion, 20 mice in the control portion. Control, if you're not familiar with that term, that's the part, those are the mice that weren't given the poison. But the 20 mice that were given the poison, you could see none of them died in the first couple days. Then you started getting on day 3, a a few mice died. Notice that more males died before the females, right? That's one of the characteristics of anticoagulants. As a rule, males die quicker than the females. I'll let you figure that out why. And then, of course, the numbers really begin to drop as they're being exposed down to 7 days. You're getting, 80%, 70% control there. And then you have a little leveling off period, and then finally you get out to day 13. All mice are dead, both male and female. So if you didn't know this already, one of the dirty little secrets is that first generation anticoagulant rodenticides are more toxic if the animal eats a little bit each day than if you gave it a larger dose on one day. So, and that certainly is proven out here with your warfarin bait, to be sure. So, what about the mouse weights? Now, why am I talking to you about the mouse weights? This is something that's getting a little bit more arcane. But again, those of us in the vertebrate pest control field, we're interested in that. Is this bait going to be consumed by the mouse? Because warfarin, let's just say warfarin is perfectly toxic enough to kill the rodent, but it doesn't matter if the rodent's not going to eat it, right? So how much are they eating? Are they eating enough? Because here we are in a choice test. You say, well, doesn't the choice test eliminate some of those concerns? It eliminates some of those concerns. It doesn't eliminate all those concerns, right? Because there's a difference between lab and reality, right? So, because the lab is, the best thing we got toward reality, but because reality tests they add another level of difficulty to things, right? So, usually you have a process. You start with the lab work, get that kind of proof of concept. You get that verify it that, yeah, things can work. And then you have to then proceed to the field work. I don't know if Kaput is going to be doing any type of field work, but I don't know if they are or not. But certainly for you in the field, you're going to need to kind of pay attention. How is this particular product working for you? And one of the ways we can look at is, how did the mice weigh under the laboratory conditions? And so what they did here was they had both the choice tests and the simulated tests. And you notice that the control animals here, let me kind of get my cursor out. The control animals, notice that their initial weight was 21.3. These are all in, I believe, grams. And the females, and you can see how their initial weight versus final weight. And as a general rule, they tended to gain weight in the laboratory work. Where in the treatment animals, you had a situation where they lost weight. Now, part of that's understandable because an anticoagulant, of course, is going to cause some internal bleeding, and that is certainly going to cause some weight loss. But it's also a question of, well, did they lose weight because they weren't eating enough to take care of that? So maybe the anticoagulant is going to be suppressing diet, perhaps. So just looking at some of these now, the simulated field test, notice that there was a significant loss of weight. Notice it says here, you have a little asterisk, control significantly greater than treatment. And then, of course, when you have the dollar sign, you have the initial weight of the rodent significantly higher. This is a statistical statement than the final weight. So they were really starting to drop off weight here using this. Now, let's take a look at the consumption. Did the mice continue to consume? Because, again, if the mice are not consuming a sufficient amount of the warfarin, they're not going to get a toxic dose, right? So what they found is that in the choice tests, CD is the control diet or the challenge diet, and then the RTB is the rodent tick bait. Notice how in pretty much every situation here, the control bait, or what they call the challenge bait, the rodents ate more than the treated bait in every situation. Now, not a lot, but notice that the acceptance rate, it wasn't, you would think if they just was random, the mouse, it would be a 50-50, right? Maybe the rodent that, ate the challenge bait on one day, and then, the next time I'm going to feed, I'm going to go to the treated bait. And if it was just a random thing, you'd think it would be a 50-50. But as a general rule here, the rodents chose less time on the treated bait than they did the challenge bait. So is that necessarily unusual? In terms of my memory and experience, no, that's probably characteristic of a lot of rodenticides, but it's just something to keep in mind when you're testing it, because I would encourage you to try to check it out if you're in an area where you have clients that are concerned about ticks and you have an area where white-footed mice are certainly a problem. This is something you may want to think about adding to your toolbox, but you want to try to keep some data on it and to see how things are working for you. Don't just rely on your memory. Do the work, finding out if it's going to work for you in your particular situation, and are you getting good consumption among your mice? Are you getting good control with your mice as well? So here's some concluding thoughts about this. Ticks and Lyme disease are serious problems in America, and I'm really glad that we have a product that now is part of that mix of helping us treat these situations, because it's these fragmented landscapes where ticks kind of thrive. They're kind of an edge species, right? So, and that's where houses are, right? People like to have their lawn, and then they have some bigger vegetation, especially people out into the suburbs, right? They want to have their trees to sort of separate them from their neighbors. They may have some acreage, maybe an acre of trees, and then their grass area, right? So this is sort of prime tick country. Of course, white-footed mice love this sort of environment as well. This tool can be part of that solution for trying to knock down some of the problems that we're having with Lyme disease, right? So, because it did prove that the treated mice did consume enough fipronil to kill the ticks that were biting on the mice. That's good news, right? So thank God for that. But the questions that I have, and I just want you to think about, right, is will this product work as well under field conditions where the rodent has a lot more distractions as it did in the lab? It could be that it works better because maybe your bait station is the best available food, and it's also a secure resource for the rodent. So maybe it'll work better than the lab, right? So this is something you have to sort of trial in your own experience, but don't just simply, if you're going to try it, be sure you're keeping good records beyond whatever your state agency is requiring you to do. Make sure you're thinking about, are you getting good consumption? What kind of weather conditions are you doing? Were you testing it in the winter or during the summer closer to harvest season where people had beautiful gardens, right? Full of food available for the rodents, right? How much competing food was available? Did you have a high mast year, right? With lots of acorns. That can be a competing food, because no toxic bait is going to be able to compete with a smorgasbord or a dumpster of alternative food, right? That's just not fair. So give it a fair shot if you decide to use this particular product, but you at least know that it's something that it's available, it's legal, and warfarin, of course, has a lot of benefits to it in terms of its significantly lower secondary poisoning concerns, in which, of course, as you know, is becoming a greater concern, as rightfully it should, across the United States. And so I'm excited. I'm always wanting to encourage. It's a lot of work for manufacturers to come up with new products, and so I'm always loath to just simply to bash something. Anyone could be a critic, right? So we want to see. I'd be interested in those of you who are able to try this out. What was your success like? You can certainly reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Well, that's it for me today. Check it out. Ticks are bad. We don't want white-footed mice in people's homes either, because there's also hantavirus associated with them, so that's certainly a problem. So check it out. Maybe this is something you can add to your particular toolbox, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for listening to the show. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Do let me know what your thoughts are about the show. Subscribe to the channel. If you don't want to be dealing with YouTube, definitely check me out over on Rumble. Just look up Wildlife Control Consultant and you'll find my podcast there. If you're interested in being on the show, or perhaps you have ideas for the show, definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. And of course, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.